So what has made Romeo and Juliet stand the test of time? It's the use of its amazing language. The first one is an allusion. You should all be familiar with allusions, as we've been using them in many of the other novels. An allusion is a reference to a great work of literature. In Romeo and Juliet specifically, it is typically biblical or mythological. Let's look at the example I have below. Well, in that hit you miss. She'll not be hit with Cupid's arrow, she hath Diana's wit. And so therefore in this one, we see that Cupid is alluded to and Diana is alluded to. Who is Cupid? Cupid is the little guy who shoots an arrow and makes you fall in love. Who is Diana? Diana is a Roman god who believes in chastity. That means no sex. So if you reread, it says, well, in that hit you miss, she will not be hit with the arrow that will make her fall in love because she has Diana's wit, which is devout chastity. Next we have an aside. An aside are words spoken in an undertone for the audience to hear, but not a certain character. So think of somebody sitting there and having a side conversation to let another character know something, but making sure the other main characters are unaware. Think of even TV shows like Modern Family, The Office, The Bachelor, Bachelorette, Awkward. These all use some form of asides in today's society. Couplet. A couplet is pretty easy. Think of your base word couple, which means two. It is a pair of rhymed lines. So the example you see here, my only love sprung from my only hate. Too early seen, unknown, too late. So you see the last two words of those lines, hate and late, rhyme. Next we see here is a foil. We dealt with foils when it came to the reading of Mice and Men. Remember that Lenny and Curly were foils for each other. Lenny was very gentle and Curly was very aggressive. So once again, a foil is when two characters' personalities are completely opposite of one another, therefore accentuating each other's personality. From Romeo and Juliet, we have two characters are similar. We have Benvolio, who is steady, kind, and who has a peaceable nature. In contrast is Tybalt, who's very impulsive, rash, and very hot-headed. Hyperbole. A hyperbole is an exaggeration for emphasis, often referred to as an overstatement. So in Act 3, Scene 3, Romeo remarks that every cat and dog and little mouse, every unworthy thing live here in heaven and look upon her. Well, obviously Romeo does not mean every single cat and every single dog and every single little mouse. He's over-exaggerating. It's probably similar to when you try to tell your parents, but everybody is going to that party. Obviously, it's not everybody. Next, we have an oxymoron. Oxymorons are paired words that are opposites. So think about jumbo shrimp, icy hot, bright smoke, cold fire. Anytime you use words to convey a message, but the words actually are an opposite of each other. A simile is something we saw over and over again in Shoeless Joe. It is a comparison between two things using like or as. For example, in Act 3, Scene 2, Juliet describes her state of suspense by saying, so tedious is this day, as is the night before some festival. So she's making a comparison of two things. Likewise to the simile, we have the metaphor. Once again, the metaphor we saw over and over again in Shoeless Joe. A metaphor is a comparison of two things that are dissimilar in which one is described in terms of another, but you are not using like or as. Another term that is specific to drama is the soliloquy. A soliloquy, think of the word solo, is when a character is alone on stage expressing his or her thoughts or feelings. It is usually longer than an aside, and it is not directed at the audience. If you've ever heard of the famous balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet, this would be a soliloquy. Similar to the soliloquy is the word monologue. Think of your base word mono again. It means one. This is a character who gives a long, uninterrupted speech in the presence of other characters. So let's ask ourselves, what is the difference between a monologue and a soliloquy? A monologue, the person is alone on stage, but it's in the presence of other characters. A soliloquy is typically when the character is completely alone on stage, but it's giving insights into his or her inner thoughts or conflicts. Personification. This is when we give human qualities to inanimate objects. For example, from Romeo and Juliet, hath death lain with thy wife? See, there she lies, flower as she was, deflowered by him. Death is my son-in-law, death is my heir, my daughter he hath wedded. Notice that death is being treated as if he's a male. The male has wedded the girl, and death has deflowered her. If she was a flower, which indicates she was a virgin prior to marriage, then after the marriage she became deflowered by death. A stanza is just a major subdivision in a poem. We've already talked about the 2-line stanza. Anybody remember what that's called? It's called a couplet. 3 lines is a tercet or a triplet. 4 lines is a quatrain, quintet, sestet, and it goes from there. The only one you really are responsible for is going to be the couplet. Next we have a sonnet. Shakespeare is famous for writing sonnets. It is a 14-line poem with a specific rhyme scheme of A-B-A-B, C-D-C-D, E-F-E-F, G-G. So if you look at the color coding down below in this particular sonnet, you will see the lines that rhyme. 2 households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parent strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage. The which if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend. Next, we have iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is really fun. It is a single line which is made up of 10 syllables. They are 5 pairs of short and long, or what you'd call stressed or unstressed syllables. So if you look below, you see it says, 2 households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. You'll notice that each line has 10 syllables. That's what makes the sonnets so cool. Not only does it have 14 lines with a specific rhyme scheme, each line has only 10 syllables. Malapropism is an inappropriateness of speech resulting from the use of one word for another which resembles it. Specifically, we have the nurse in Romeo and Juliet who uses the word confidence when she should be using the word conference. Or Benvolio when he says she will indict him to supper when he should have used the word invite. The purpose of this is to show a lower class citizen trying to use a higher vocabulary. A motif is a repeating image, element, or theme throughout a play. Pay close attention as you read to light and darkness and death, as you will see these repeated throughout the play. Comic relief is something that is much needed. It is a humorous scene, incident, or speech that relieves the overall emotional intensity. So think about when you're in a movie and it's very intense, maybe it's very sad or very mellow, and then something happens which makes you start laughing out loud. This breaks up the intensity of what's going on. Colloquial language is informal, sometimes slang language. Oftentimes it is vulgar, and its speech sets common characters apart from those of a higher station. For example, the servants, Mercutio, and the nurse often suggest sexual matters where Romeo and Juliet use only poetic language talking about love. The servants, Mercutio, and the nurse, in their sexual references, make the audience often laugh, but Romeo and Juliet would never stoop so low as to use that type of language. Double entendres. This is a phrase that has 2 meanings, especially one where one is very innocent and literal, and the other is risque, bawdy, or ironic. Oftentimes it's referred to as an innuendo. Think about when you go to see kids' movies, and the kids enjoy the movie for one reason, but the adults get a whole nother message in the movies which makes them laugh. Earlier, we talked about a hyperbole or an overstatement. This time we have what's called an understatement. This is to make little of something that is actually quite important. For example, Mercutio tells Romeo that his wound is a scratch. It's merely a scratch. But the reality is that his wound is killing him. Next we have dramatic irony, and of course we've dealt with dramatic irony in some of the past novels, but just a reminder, it's when the audience knows something a character does not. So after a fight between Romeo and Tybalt, Juliet thinks Romeo is dead, but we will know that he is not. This is an example of dramatic irony. A tragedy is when the central figure meets with disaster or grave misfortune. And in most tragedies, the tragic hero's downfall is usually the result of fate's intervention or a character flaw or tragic flaw. Because of this, we tend to feel very bad for the hero when he ultimately suffers. Romeo and Juliet, however, deviates from this definition of a tragedy in several ways. First of all, the tragic hero was almost always exclusively male, But this play seems to have two tragic heroes, one male and one female. And while the characters blame fate for the outcome, the audience can see that the outcome is the direct consequence of the characters' own decisions and actions. And now for our feature presentation, Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. The story is based around a pair of star-crossed teenage lovers. Star-crossed is an important term for you to remember because what it means is that their stars were not aligned when they met, and so they were doomed from the beginning. These two teenagers pursue their love for one another despite the fact that their families have been at odds with each other for decades. But once again, they're star-crossed, so we know things will not turn out well. The setting of the story is Verona, Italy in the 14th century. Please remember that setting always means time and place. Okay, let's meet the families. We have two families, the Montagues and the Capulets. Our first Capulet is Juliet. She is a beautiful 13-year-old girl who's very naive and thinks very little of love and marriage. Because she is a girl from an aristocratic family, she does not have the freedom to roam the streets or date, and her closest friend is her nurse. The nurse is also referred to as kind of like her nanny. We now have Lord Capulet. This is Juliet's father. He absolutely loves his daughter, but he is not aware of her feelings or thoughts. He absolutely commands respect and propriety. He's very quick to lose his temper, and he's the type of father who, you do as I say. We next have Lady Capulet. This is Juliet's mother, Lord Capulet's wife. She married Lord Capulet at a very young age. She was approximately 14 years of age when she married him. She's very eager to see Juliet marry because it's very common for young girls to marry. She relies heavily on the nurse to mother Juliet as she's very hands-off, and she could be very vain and small-minded. Next, we have Tybalt. Tybalt lives a motto, which is ready to live, kill, or die for honor. He is Juliet's cousin on the mother's side. He's vain, fashionable, lacks courtesy. He's aggressive, violent, quick to draw his sword, and he absolutely loathes, despises the Montagues. Now we are going to meet the Montagues. Our first young man is Romeo. He's handsome, intelligent, and sensitive. Unfortunately, he's also very impulsive and immature. He's not interested in violence, only love. Some would even say he's a lover, not a fighter. We also have Lord Montague, Romeo's father, and all we really know about him is that he is a bitter enemy of Lord Capulet. We also have Benvolio. Benvolio is Lord Montague's nephew, Romeo's cousin, and very thoughtful friend. He makes a genuine effort to diffuse violent scenes in public places, which is kind of ironic that he has a gun in his hand, but this is from the current-day Romeo and Juliet film, which was made to be more current day. Other important players are, one of my favorites, Mercutio. He is Romeo's very, very close friend. He's imaginative, quick-witted. He's very sarcastic. He absolutely loves wordplay. Unfortunately, he's also hot-headed, especially with people who are pretentious or obsessed with the latest fashions. He often gets very tiresome of Romeo because Romeo is just way too romantic. Mercutio is a great character who brings lots of comic relief to the play. We also have the nurse. As I told you before, the nurse is kind of like a nanny to Juliet. She has cared for Juliet her entire life, although she's like Mercutio in the fact that she's vulgar. She's also very long-winded and sentimental. She provides a tremendous amount of comic relief. She also believes in love and wants Juliet to have a nice-looking husband. Next, we have Friar Lawrence. A friar is another name for a priest. He is a Catholic man. He is a friend to both the Montagues and the Capulets, and we should know he's always ready with a plan. This means that when things don't go well, everyone turns to him. The next young man who's important is Paris. Paris is betrothed to Juliet. That means that he is supposed to ultimately marry her someday. He's quite handsome, and according to Juliet's family, he's a good catch. Another important player is Prince Escalus. He is the ruler of Verona. Think of him as the guy who decides the fate of everyone. He is also related to Mercutio and Paris. Remember that Mercutio is Romeo's best friend, and Paris is betrothed to marry Juliet. He is very concerned with maintaining the public peace at all costs. And so we begin, Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare.